Serendipity is all about this idea that we can, in a way, see something in the unexpected and then connect the dots and do something with it. These kind of moments where we turn something that is unexpected into some kind of positive outcome and make an accident meaningful. But also what I'm super fascinated by is how we also can obviously make accidents more meaningful, but also create these kind of accidents, those positive coincidences. And so that's what it's all about, these kind of positive unexpected outcomes.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Artists of Data Science podcast, the only self-development podcast for data scientists. You're going to learn from and be inspired by the people, ideas, and conversations that will encourage creativity and innovation in yourself so that you can do the same for others. I also host open office hours. You can register to attend by going to bit.ly/ADSOH. I look forward to seeing you all there. Let's ride this beat out into another awesome episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a 5-star review. Our guest today is an internationally known expert in the areas of innovation and entrepreneurship. He holds a PhD in networks and entrepreneurship and an MSc in management, both from the London School of Economics. He's currently the director of the Global Economy Program at New York University's Center for Global Affairs, where he teaches on purpose-driven leadership, impact entrepreneurship, social innovation, and emerging markets. Today, he's here to talk about his latest book, The Serendipity Mindset, which develops a science-based framework for individuals and companies to help prompt and leverage positive accidents. So please, help me welcoming our guest today, a man whose presentations and workshops at companies have impacted over 1.2 million people, Dr. Christian Busch. Dr. Busch, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come on the show. I really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to get into a little bit of your background. So let's talk about what kind of kid you were in high school and what did you think your future would look like while you were in high school?
Yeah, well, I was this kind of rebellious kid who try to push every boundary you can push. I had to repeat a year in high school. In fact, I had to change schools, as they called it. I was essentially expelled. And so didn't find real ways to channel my energy. And so I still have so much respect for my parents in terms of, enduring me during that time. And I think, we had a conversation yesterday about how much, parents obviously shape our mindsets. And I think my parents, despite me being that kind of rebellious kid, always gave me this feeling of worthiness and kindness. And so I think there's a lot that stuck with me throughout the years.
And how different is life now than what you had imagined it would be when you were that age?
Extremely different. And, I had an experience early on in life when I was 18, a car crash that kind of completely changed how I looked at the world. I think before that it was essentially great. Let's live into the day. Let's enjoy everything and, go out and party and everything else. And then I had that kind of car crash and I realized, wow, life can be over at any point, right? You can run in front of a car every day. And so it put me on this intense search for meaning and trying to figure out what is life all about? What can I do in this world that is somehow meaningful? And so if I would ever again run in front of a car or have any other kind of accidents, it hopefully would have been worth it by then.
And after you went through that accident, did you kind of get your act together? Like what was the journey like from that rebellious teenager to now, Dr. Christian Busch? What happened during that period?
Yeah, I started reading a lot of Viktor Frankl. So he has this wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, and I got extremely inspired by it because it has this idea of finding meaning in every situation, finding meaning especially in crises. And so it kind of really got me onto this, trying to find my own meaning, my own purpose. And I realized what I enjoy doing the most is bringing people together, connecting ideas, connecting kind of things and ideas and dots. And so, I started out as a community builder and then over time kind of entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and then went to academia. And all of this was all about kind of how do we try to understand how dots connect, but also, enable others to connect those in meaningful ways.
So speaking of connecting dots and seeing how things connect, let's jump into serendipity. How do you define serendipity? What is this thing?
Yeah, so serendipity is really this kind of smart luck. So it's very different from the blind luck that's all about the idea of essentially, inheriting something, being born into a good family. That's kind of things we can't really influence, right? It's the kind of passive happening to us type luck. But serendipity is all about this idea that we can, in a way, see something the unexpected and then connect the dots and do something with it. So, this kind of quintessential situation, if you have erratic hand movements like me, you spill coffee all the time, right? So imagine yourself being in a coffee shop, spilling that coffee over someone next to you, and you sense that kind of connection. You sense there might be something there. And now you have two options, right? To react to this unexpected situation. You could either say, oh, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. And then you walk outside and you're like, I should have talked with this person. I should have kind of continued some kind of conversation. Or the other option is, you say something like, oh, I'm so sorry. I was kind of so focused on XYZ book that I've just been reading and blah, blah, and you start a conversation and see where it leads. And maybe that's where you find your love or your co-founder or something else. And so it's really these kind of moments where we turn something that is unexpected into some kind of positive outcome and make an accident meaningful. But also what I'm super fascinated by is how we also can obviously make accidents more meaningful, but also create these kind of accidents, those positive coincidences. And so that's what it's all about, these kind of positive, unexpected outcomes.
So yeah, there's like that dumb luck, blind luck, which you kind of have no real control over. And then there's the luck that comes from the unique character and unique actions that you take that kind of just are kicking up dust and you are there to take advantage of all that dust that you've kicked up. So that's kind of what serendipity is.
Exactly.
So you talk about 3 different types of serendipity in your book. If you're able to share those 3 types with us, that would be awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's really about the question of, am I already looking for something or is something completely different. And so what does that mean? Imagine some kind of situation where you're like, you're looking for a job, right? So you're looking for something out there already. And then you bump into someone in a coffee shop who tells you about a new job, coincidentally, right? That person you spilled the coffee over maybe might be that person, right? And so in a way, you already had a certain problem out there that you wanted to do something with, but actually then kind of something unexpected happens and you relate it to that bigger problem. So that happens a lot of times in companies, for example. Let's say you have a bigger purpose where you try to go or some kind of sense of direction, then you bump into someone and still where you want to go, but in a way it kind of changes how you get there or what you do about it, which is very different from the kind of, let's say you're strolling around and you're actually quite happy in your life. And then you bump into someone who tells you about something completely different. Hey, look, I just opened up a shop in Nicaragua. Do you want to come over and spend your life there? And you're like, oh, okay. And so you kind of related to that your brother maybe wanted to anyways build a business there or whatever it is. And that serendipity happens. And so the 3 forms are really all about the question, did you already imagine somewhere where you want to go? Or did you kind of think about something that came completely randomly up? And I think the reason why, it doesn't really matter which type of serendipity happens, but what matters is I think this idea that a lot of times, especially when you're in companies or, when you're kind of having some goal in mind, it does help us to connect dots better and smarter because it kind of helps us to imagine what we could relate something to versus just kind of wandering around and searching around.
So it sounds like these different types of serendipity, they share some core characteristics. So does serendipity have an anatomy? And if so, what does that anatomy look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really comes to the point of when we think about it as something active, we see that it's essentially a process, right? It's something where something unexpected happens. So this kind of trigger, the serendipity trigger, like spilling the coffee or whatever, running into a person at a conference, these kind of things. And now it's all about doing something with it, right? Connecting the dots. So in a way, that kind of active element of it, but then also it's about having the tenacity to actually do something with it and turn that into something, right? So if I run into you at a conference and you tell me about your great podcast and you're like, hey, great, I'm doing this. Like I still then have to, say, oh my God, such a coincidence. I just wrote a book about, literal coincidence. So we should connect. And then again, it's up to both of us to have the tenacity to follow up on this, making it happen. Right. And so a lot of times we can miss serendipity at every step. We might not see it in the moment, or we might then just not follow up on it and then kind of get distracted and not get there. And so I think that's the beauty of it, that then at every step we can do something. We can create more of these triggers. We can learn how to connect the dots, but also we can work on our grit and our tenacity.
What's up, artists? I would love to hear from you. Feel free to send me an email to theartistsofdatascience@gmail.com. Let me know what you love about the show. Let me know what you don't love about the show. And let me know what you would like to see in the future. I absolutely would love to hear from you. I've also got open office hours that I will be hosting, and you can register by going to bit.ly/ADSOH. I look forward to hearing from you all, and I look forward to seeing you in the office hours. Let's get back to the episode. And you talk about this really interesting concept. Actually, the first time I heard of this concept, this word, the bisociation. So can you kind of describe that to us, and how is it similar or different to then in association?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, in the end, it's all about connecting dots, right? And it's all about saying, what is that kind of moment where like you bring two potentially previously disparate things together, right? And so I think a lot of times we think of this as like one moment where, this eureka moment when you're like, in the shower on a Sunday, and like you like slightly like something connects and you're like, oh my God, like such a coincidence, now this is connecting. And so what's happening there obviously is in your brain kind of different synapses and other things kind of connected and like literally dots, right? And that's the same in like real life when we try to connect some information to some other information. Like in a way, we're bringing them together and merge them into something. And the reason I'm excited about it is because if you think about everything from creativity to how new ideas emerge to like how up to 50% of inventions and innovations happen, usually it is because people are able to connect dots to something. And so, take an example like Viagra, where, kind of researchers looked for something completely different. They gave people medication, they against angina. They realized there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And then instead of just saying, oh my God, this is kind of like embarrassing and this is something we should ignore or find a better way to cure angina, they said, you know what? Like they bisociated, they connect the dots. They said, you know what? There's a lot of people in the world who might have that problem. So why don't we like make a medication around this? And so that kind of connecting the dots is really what's exciting about it.
It seems like the key to doing that is having that open mind to be able to look at things not just from a tunnel vision type of perspective. So like what would be some of the biggest barriers or blockers to prevent us from thinking in this way?
Well, I mean, if you think about, I mean, all of us have quite a few biases, right? I mean, if we want or not, I mean, I realized when kind of going on this journey, like how many assumptions I have that are just not true, right? So for example, one being we constantly underestimate how probable it is that the improbable happens. So how the unexpected happens all the time, right? Like all the time there, and I think COVID probably is like the biggest reminder of this, right? That like there's only so much we can plan. And if you look at your CV, for example, you might tell it as a story where you went from this job to this job to this job. Yeah, but you know what? If you really look at it, probably you ran into someone who told you about something, then you jump somewhere else. And so it's really this kind of thing where we constantly underestimate the unexpected and how often it happens. And what it does then is, we don't realize a lot of times when it's there, and so we don't do something with it. But also when it happens, it doesn't like fit into our stories. And so we, a lot of times, kind of try to make it into a story where we control more than we actually did. And so one of the things that I'm super excited about is this question of how do we get away from this idea of post-rationalizing everything, where we try to kind of, in a way, always pretend that we had it all mapped out and then tell the story as if we all had it all figured out, which in a way makes us all lie to each other, right? Because if you look at like what a lot of CEOs do, right? They go to their board and they say, oh, great, like this was my plan and I did exactly what I wanted to do. And everyone knows that like they couldn't have known all of this. And so one of the reasons I'm so excited about this idea of cultivating serendipity is that in a way what you're doing is you're taking away the illusion of control. You're taking away this idea that you can plan everything out. But what you're doing is you're saying, you know what, give us a sense of direction, give us an idea of where we're going, but at the same time create a culture that allows us to be ready for the unexpected, because then essentially you're not losing control, quite the opposite. You're incorporating the unexpected into everything you're doing. And so I think then essentially once we overcome this bias to not underestimating the unexpected, we can create this muscle that allows us to essentially make the best out of it.
So one thing I really appreciated about in your book was the fact that you're so open and vulnerable with your story, talking about the struggles you had as a rebellious high schooler, and then your not so linear path to where you are today. I really appreciated that. And it actually has given me courage and strength to really talk about my story more openly, because much like you, I was a very rebellious high schooler. Like, I didn't initially graduate high school, and then I had several missteps along the way. And, you know, anybody that lands on my LinkedIn page looks at it, it looks like a clear just story, right? But there's so much that happened in between there that it's just not there. And I've just, because of you sharing it, I've just been more open to embracing that part of my history. Thank you for that. Speaking about being able to see the connections and being able to see those things happen, you've got this concept in your book about alertness. So talk to us a little bit more about alertness and how this promotes serendipity.
Yeah, and obviously I'm really excited to hear that somehow, I mean, one of the hopes I have with this kind of book is really to say, at the end of the day, we all have a certain narrative of self, but at the same time, we also all go through similar struggles from time to time, right? And it's perfect. I mean, you know, I work a lot at the moment, especially with kind of high school kids and others, around the question of how do we make sure that everyone feels it's okay to wing it at times. It's okay to not always be perfect. It's okay to, and so I'm really kind of, I'm grateful that you say that, because I feel it's one of the biggest like hopes I have with the book, to say we can all, in a way, we all feel like imposters at times. We all feel like, you know, that we haven't figured it all out, and that's fine, right? That's kind of really something. So that's really very close to my heart. With regard to alertness, I mean, something that I found fascinating is, so I'm a big fan of this experiment, maybe to bring that point home, where a colleague took people who self-identify as extremely lucky and people who self-identify as extremely unlucky. And they took one of each and they said, walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, grab a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have an interview at some point. What they didn't tell them is that there's hidden cameras across the street, that there's a £5 note in front of the door. So there's money in front of the door. And then there's only one table in the coffee shop next to this extremely successful businessman who can make a lot of ideas happen and dreams happen. And so now the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the coffee shop, has a conversation with the barista, sits down next to the businessman, has a nice conversation, they exchange business cards, potential opportunity coming on. We don't know that part. The unlucky person just walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, the other person's left, ignores the businessman, that's that. At the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made new friends, and, you know, potential opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And, you know, that's kind of like a lot about this idea that the quote unquote lucky person that frames the world as something where potentially good things can happen actually sees those unexpected things more, because they expect them to potentially be there. And so it opens our idea of, okay, there are things out there that could be there. And, you know, a lot of things, we can talk about this later, how we then, once we are alert to these kind of things, you know, we see opportunity in diversity, in adversity, and so on. But I'm a big fan of this idea that at the end of the day, in every situation, there's always something in there, even if it doesn't seem at that moment, that over the long run can potentially trigger some kind of serendipity, or at least something that can be positive. And so, you know, I've done a lot of work, and I'm very close with people who have lost kind of, you know, people around them, or who have had very bad luck. And the interesting thing is, a lot of times those moments then are the moments where either those moments frame the person, or the person frames the moment in their life. And I think that to me is like a biggest thing, because obviously we can never blame someone for bad luck, and we can never, you know, all of us, I think, at our lives at some point have bad luck. There's structural constraints. There's a lot of different things that we cannot influence. But one thing we can influence is our reaction to the unexpected. And I think like what I'm really curious always about is to see, how do we train ourselves to see something in the unexpected always, especially if it's bad luck, that we can turn into something positive. And so that's really about this kind of being alert to these kind of opportunities that are in the unexpected, being at a 5-pound note on the floor, being at, these kind of different types of potential triggers that could be there.
It's interesting how much self-talk can influence these type of opportunities and influence these, the way you perceive things. Like what's the importance of that self-talk when it comes to creating our own good luck and creating our own serendipity?
It's interesting because, if you think about, so if I think about, my own life, but also the life that I've seen a lot of people live, I will not forget I had a wonderful conversation in London with a gentleman at some point who, I asked him, so how often do you have serendipity? And he works like in a restaurant and he's a great guy. And I asked him and he was like, well, before I was 25, never. And after I was 25, all the time. And I asked like, what changed? What changed? And he was like, well, look, before I was 25, I never acted on, even if I saw something unexpected that could be positive, I didn't act on it because I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel, all these different things. And then I went through a journey of, surrounding myself with people who were more optimistic, because people who also told me, look, you don't have to be in that idea that's because he grew up in this environment where his parent would tell him, people like us are not supposed to work in XYZ. People like us will always be in service. Like we are not the kind of people who do XYZ different. And so there was this kind of whole like idea in his head, I'm not worthy of this kind of opportunity. I'm not worthy of XYZ. And so then kind of he went through this journey of both surrounding himself with people, with different people, but also kind of telling himself and starting to really go into this journey of building his own self-confidence. And what was fascinating was that, people would always, like he used to work as a waiter, and people would always tell him about like things and always say, let me introduce you to this person, so on, so on, so on. So he would always say, no, I don't want to. And once he started doing it then, because of this kind of journey he went through, it started to happen. I think that kind of like, I've seen a lot of these kind of stories and patterns where in a way, again, there's structural constraints a lot of times. And I think we have to be super aware of that. And then I think a lot of times, especially for us, right, in our surroundings, there is a lot of times these kind of self-limiting beliefs also in terms of how to, not go. And so I think this kind of whole importance of also, seeing ourselves, creating a new narrative of self is super important.
Do you think there's a relationship between the reticular activating system in the brain and serendipity that makes it possible for us to see these opportunities? Like if we're constantly talking to ourselves in a positive way, we're constantly having good thoughts and then just thinking of ways that we can connect things, and we're just going to see more opportunities to connect things in the outside world.
It's a great question. And, it's what I found fascinating on this journey of kind of diving deep into those themes is that in a way, sciences, everything from kind of neuroscience to psychology to quantum physics to spirituality increasingly say the same thing, right? That in a way, like when you kind of put yourself into a certain motion, then essentially like something becomes more probable, right? It's like entropy, like the bicycle, right? If you don't ride a bicycle, it falls. And so like you have to continuously go and do something about it. And the same with like, in psychology, to your point, right? If you visualize things, if you literally manifest things in your mind, and kind of start doing it, you start seeing more things that could relate to it. You start seeing things kind of like going into that way. And again, then energetically similar, right? Once you kind of like then, people react to energy, right? And so it's kind of, I think like to your question, that I think the beautiful thing is that all these different perspectives like all say the same thing, that yes, like in a way, once you put yourself on a trajectory like this, even if it's tough, right? I mean, I had COVID in March, like it was a really bad period. I couldn't breathe. I had 911 on speed dial. It was really like, it's the kind of period where you're like, yeah, easy to say good energy and XYZ, but what do you do when you're in a really bad place? But I reread the Viktor Frankl, right? And this guy, he survived the Holocaust. He was in a concentration camp. And even in that kind of moments, he still kind of found this way of saying, hey, look, I will still every day talk with at least one other person to make them feel better about themselves. And by doing that, that gives me meaning. And I think that kind of reminded me, right, that in every situation, you can always reframe something. You can always still do something. And in that moment, it was about, okay, if I'm sitting here in my bed and I can't properly breathe, can I then, like, what can I do with this? Is there something that, can I re-anchor myself in the meaning that I've had last time when I had an incident like this, which kind of showed me how close death can be and so on. And so I think, in a way, to your point, that I think we if we can use these moments to remember that in a way we can frame the world in a certain way, that probably helps us. I mean, since then, like, I've been again on a kind of, I want to shape the world again, because again, it was a reminder how quickly life can be over.
I'm so glad that you recovered from that with no ill effects. It's definitely a scary time, and I can't imagine suffering that. And yeah, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, excellent read. Highly recommend it to anybody that's listening. That was kind of like my introduction to like Stoic philosophy and Stoicism, and it got me really deep into that. And just the absolute beautiful operating system for life, to put it plainly, I guess. So I know something that my audience is really going to be interested in is talking about the importance of the why and how we can do a better job at defining problem statements.
Yeah. And that's an interesting question, both in terms of, if you think about individuals, and then if you, let's say, build your startup, or if you kind of create a team, or, so in a way the collective why and the individual why, because I mean, if you think about it, why are we, so if we look at it in terms of both, in a way, the bigger why in the terms of like, hey, here's a sense of direction, here's like a way of how we can then understand how to connect something with, Paul Polman has always been really good at this. The guy who ran Unilever for a long time. He had this kind of idea of, the reason I'm here in this world is because I want to help other people help themselves if they're in XYZ position. And so if people would come with new projects, he would always think about, okay, does this project really relate to this? If it doesn't relate to this, it doesn't work. And so the why gives us a beautiful filter to filter projects, to filter ideas, and to also avoid distraction, right? Because too much serendipity can really distract it. But also, to your point of problem statements, I think what's interesting is that a lot of times if we, over-specify problems or over-specify things, in a way we're completely decreasing the potential opportunity space, right? Because if I tell you, I don't know, decrease costs, and we just have to kind of like, make more money, then you think in those terms, and you think about, how can I fire people? How can I do X, Y, Z? But if I tell you our bigger purpose is X, Y, Z, and now find me every way to either make more profit or to cut costs, or, make more revenues or cut costs, or whatever it is, you become much more creative. And I think it's these kind of things where a lot of times it's the question of, how do we make sure that people know why they're doing something, but also how do we not over-define problems in ways that then limit how people can think about solutions to whatever problem we define for them.
Absolutely love that portion of the book. That was really, really insightful. Thanks for digging into that for the audience there. So jumping now into a kind of, I guess, more maybe the anatomy-ish of serendipity, this concept of a serendipity trigger. You talk to us about what that means, what that serendipity trigger is, and how it comes down to asking two basic questions.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I mean, if you think about, like, how do you essentially, put some kind of dots out there that essentially potentially could create serendipity, right? Because again, triggers a lot of times happen and we can't influence them, right? COVID, we couldn't influence. If a volcano breaks out, we can't influence. If a hurricane happens, we can't influence. And then it's mostly our reaction to that. But I think the part that I'm most excited about is, how do we create dots for us and for others? And so one example, just to kind of show how that is in practice, is setting hooks, right? Or casting hooks, where essentially what you would do is something like, hey, look, there's this amazing entrepreneur in London, Ollie Barrett. And if you would ask him something like, what do you do? The dreaded question we get at conferences and wherever we are, he would tell you something like, well, look, like, I'm a tech entrepreneur, but recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you three potential dots where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I just started playing the piano. Let's hang out and do a piano matinee. Or such a coincidence, my brother wrote a book on philosophy of science and is looking for a new person to help them out, whatever it is. The point is that he gives you three potential dots that he can connect, that you can connect for him. And so in a way, you can see these different triggers out there and have others connect the dots. And I think that was one of the things that I was most surprised by when doing that work, that I always assumed connecting the dots and kind of seeding things is up to us. But actually, if we seed a couple of dots, others can connect the dots for us. And so it's the teamwork of giving people excuses to connect the dots for us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that part. And I started including in some correspondences with different publicists that I talked to on behalf of getting guests on the podcast. I started saying, I'm not just into data science people. These are the other type of topics I like to talk about, and just started doing that, and just more people started coming through the funnel. So it's pretty awesome. So I really like this quote you have in the book. I don't know if you recall it or not, but it's information is at the core of life's opportunities. I thought that was such a very beautiful quote. Talk to us about what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I a lot of times I think about this from the perspective of introverts as well, because, we always assume that extroverts are favored when it comes to serendipity, right? Because as an extrovert or more extrovert, let's assume it's a continuum, and some of us are more extrovert, others. I'm a closet introvert, so I'm the kind of person who, I give a speech and then I hide in the toilet afterwards because it's too much at some point. And so it's these kind of things where, as a closet introvert, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, where does serendipity really happen? And serendipity happens, yes, when you bump into people, when you put yourself out there, when you keep in touch with people. But a lot of times it also comes out of silent sources, right? It's the information that might be in a book. It might be the information that is kind of that you create because you see something in a kind of shop window when you take another street. And so I think that the beautiful thing about serendipity is that a lot of times it's about connecting pieces of information in unexpected ways, right? And really making sense out of them. And so I think what I'm super excited about is exactly how do we essentially, put kind of informational pieces out there. And I think especially, if you think about coders, when they think about, or you talked about data scientists, I think it's so much about how do you smartly give people pieces of information that they can do something with, and that helps them connect the dots, versus just kind of putting it there. So I think the core idea is really that it's not necessarily only about knowledge that's power, but it's really kind of the informational things that get seeded, where then you can create knowledge out of it unexpectedly.
Yeah, absolutely love that part, because I just like putting ideas into my head. So just reading books, listen to audiobooks, just anything I can get my hands on that just gets some good, I guess it's like fertilizer for the garden of the mind, I guess is one way to look at it. So I'm also very, very much an introvert. I do this podcast plus doing office hours for my network of 2,500 mentees, and it becomes very draining. I have no energy to truly engage in any social interactions by the end of the week. And it becomes harder now because we live in this COVID world. What can we do to put ourselves in situations where we can find people to connect with?
Yeah, that's a great question. By the way, 2,500 mentees, that's, you can be quite proud of that, right? That's pretty impressive. It's interesting because I feel a lot of the things that we can do in quote unquote offline life, we can do online as well, right? In terms of how do we respond to questions by seeding different types of information? How do we ask questions differently? So in terms of when you are on a Zoom call and meet a new person, how do you understand their interests and motivations versus just okay, what do you do, and all these different types of things. But also then in a way, I'm a big fan of kind of social roulette, for example, where startups have started to connect people randomly across the organization who don't know each other yet. So you put I'm free on Friday at 10 o'clock, and then another person is free, then they just match them up, give them an inspirational question, and they meet for lunch. And so that's kind of the typical water cooler moment, right? Which doesn't happen at the moment, but you can create that online a little bit like that. I'm also a big fan of literally using every conversation, every interaction to think proactively about, okay, everything that someone tells me, how do I not take it only at face value, but how do I constantly think about what is behind this? What are the assumptions? And how does this relate to someone or something I know? And so something that I've seen with myself and others we create the most serendipity when we think constantly about how does this relate now to something I've read, to something I talk with a friend, and how can I introduce them to someone and something. And so I think like getting with this mind of constantly connecting the dots can help everywhere, because then every Zoom call, every conversation becomes something that can be fun, because you're like, oh, I thought I talked with this person 100 times, but by slightly changing how I go into this, there's so many new things that are coming out of it. And, there's a lot of tactics and strategies, and I'm sure, I'd love to hear, by the way, which one your favorites are, but from the book. But I think in general, I'm a big fan of not adding something to our repertoire, not adding, we're all busy, we all have to do a lot of things, but really kind of like slightly reframing how we have our day-to-day conversations, how we connect with people. And I think that's where a lot of the magic happens.
Yeah, I really like the flipping the networking on its head, where instead of saying, oh, what do, you ask one of these more interesting type of questions, like, oh, what are you currently inspired by? Like I very recently, after reading your book, switched up the questions to my random round because the ones you had in there in the networking section were just like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, what are you most excited about right now? What are you currently exploring? What are you inspired by? Really, really great questions. I never thought about ever going beyond that. What do you do? Some really good tips in there for the people like me who are not good at small talk. So really appreciated that. And the thing is, you don't even need like a large network in order for you to find people to connect with, right? And then you could find meetup groups online. You could join groups on LinkedIn. Just find some way to connect with people.
Yeah, yeah.
Another thing that I really, really enjoyed in the book was this concept of disjunction strategies that we can use to foster serendipity. There's that remixing, rebooting, deconstruction. Wondered if you can get into those for us. Like that concept of remixing, man, it aligns so well with my worldview. A few months back, I read this real cool book by Austin Kleon, Steal Like an Artist, and kind of helped foster my worldview of everything being a remix. So it was really cool to see that in your book. But can you share that with the audience first, those three concepts: remixing, rebooting, and deconstruction?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I love that you kind of directly have that new life happening. And because obviously, I mean, the whole idea is, how do you learn from things like filmmaking and the arts to, take different types of perspective on things. And I think, the thing that I've been most excited about is I've seen that a lot when I used to work in startups, right? We kind of, we would work on something and then from time to time go into another coffee shop or go into somewhere else just to kind of have a slightly different kind of setting that then kind of inspires slightly different. And so, these three strategies are just about the degree of how much you essentially, radically change a perspective or a story or a narrative and everything else. But what I always found fascinating is, in a way, how you can create exactly those moments, right? And how you completely shift perspective, how you, this kind of, a friend of mine told me yesterday about how they, unfortunately, I haven't been that much into this kind of superhero. What's the name of this kind of, like where all the superheroes come together and
Avengers.
Yes, exactly. And so, I found it fascinating because, this idea of like that you have these different narratives and then you have a meta narrative, and then depending on this, you kind of like reinvent stories of people or the history of someone, but also you have that core narrative of someone. And I find it fascinating because if you think about your own life and how often, we in our life, when you go through a midlife crisis, how you quote unquote try to reinvent yourself. But how do you do that? Do you keep the core, right? Which would be kind of the lesser type strategy where you say, oh, I'm keeping my core values and everything else, and I'm just adjusting, going from banking into consulting or something like that? Or do I completely kind of frame everything and do I become a new person and something like this? And so I think, like in the book, it's three different strategies, but I think it's much better probably now that I think of it as a continuum in terms of saying, like, how much do you want to change something up and how radical are you ready to let go of something that you have and embrace that? And I think I've been a big fan doing that personally, but also in companies. How much of your legacy do you have to let go? How much of your story, quote unquote, do you have to rewrite in order to kind of like be able to get somewhere where you want to be. But I'd really love to hear like how you experience that, and that sounded very curious, like interesting.
I guess when it comes to remixing, one thing I do constantly in data science, right, is so I've worked currently as, in a manufacturing industry, but previously I've worked in e-commerce, I've worked in insurance, and I've worked in pharmaceuticals, all as statistician, data scientist type of roles, right? So just being able to step away from the minute details of the problem and say, okay, wait, this thing that we're doing in e-commerce, for example, this churn analysis, this reminds me of something I was doing as a biostatistician. It looks a lot like survivor analysis, right? So making those connections between these different problem statements in different domains, like they might use different words and their colloquial type of language to describe what's going on in their world, but there's parallels to what you're working on. And if you can see those, then you can remix a solution, remix a methodology from one domain and apply it to your domain and apply it to your problem statement. And that's the biggest way I've seen that, at least for remixing. And also just, even when it comes to just like writing stuff for me is like definitely a remix, right? Like, I'll be doing reaction pieces to some of the books that I read, and parts of it will come from the actual book I'm reading, parts of it will come from another book, and it's just like all kind of mixed in together, and it's just me eating it up, digesting it, regurgitating it out with my own kind of voice. So yeah, that's the biggest way I've seen the remixing stuff, or even just taking like quote graphics and pictures and combining them together for a promotional piece for the podcast. Right? Like, just colliding these different ideas together. I think that really is like the foundation of creativity, is just taking things that don't look like they belong together and just smashing them into each other. I think you might be familiar with Dr. Camilla Pang. She wrote the book Explaining Humans. Right. Yeah. So she was on the podcast as well, released an episode with her a few weeks ago. And she does that very well. She takes ideas and just smashes them together and just explains something in such a new, fresh way. So yeah, it's definitely, everything's a remix, everything. So I think by now my audience knows that I have a deep affinity for the Stoics and Stoic philosophy. And I was really happy when you mentioned one of my absolute favorite Stoics in your book, Seneca. So what can Seneca teach us about serendipity?
Yeah. It's interesting, because if you think about the kind of key virtues right now around like wisdom, justice, courage, like, these kind of key things that are at the core of it. One of the things that I think is obviously interesting about serendipity is how much it is about being able to be courageous in some way, right? We talked about things like, even vulnerability. I mean, I'm a big fan of Brené Brown, about how, in a way, the most courageous thing you can do is to be vulnerable, right? And I think when you think about this, so I'm reframing now. Obviously, the Stoics probably would stone me to death to kind of go into that direction. But I think, serendipity is all about somehow sagacity, and it is all about kind of seeing something in the moment and making sense out of it. But also then, again, having the tenacity to go through with it. But I want to kind of take that to Brené Brown, because I think maybe particularly for your listeners, I think that's the kind of thing where if you think about, so we just did a study with 40 of the top CEOs in the world that run companies like MasterCard, Procter & Gamble, like really big companies. And, we essentially try to understand, what do they all have in common? And a lot of them actually have a couple of things in common. A lot of them are practical philosophers. So they ask why all the time. Like they're constantly kind of like why, questioning assumptions all the time. And then kind of real wisdom actually coming out of the idea that, hey, at the end of the day, nobody has really figured everything out, so we have to constantly question assumptions and go about it. But also then they kind of like, a lot of times I don't know what a good word for that is, but they have the courage to be not always right, in the sense that they create an environment of psychological safety where they say, okay, at the end of the day, we have this sense of direction here, but also we have not figured it all out. And so there's this slight element of vulnerability of we're not perfect, we're not all here, but that it gives people the excuse then to kind of come up with new ideas that help them kind of shape their strategies and everything else. And I think in our own lives also, right, that's at the core of a lot of these kind of life experiences of saying, we can't have all this figured out, but we can certainly kind of somehow, develop a mindset for them being able to cope with it, and not seeing it as imperfection. And I think that to me, or seeing imperfection as something that actually can be positive. And I think that to me, is at a lot of these kind of at the core of a lot of these conversations around saying, at the end of the day, if you see everything, I think Hubert Joly, who's the former chairman of Best Buy, he had this beautiful thing around meeting a monk, right? And he met that monk, and the monk essentially told him, you people, like, you're so brutal to each other because you always want everything to be perfect, but this is very inhumane, because essentially everyone who's not perfect then becomes a problem, right? Because you say, it has to be perfect, versus when you allow for a little bit of imperfection and don't see that as a problem, that's actually where then you start seeing something in the unexpected and turn that into positive outcomes. I'm rephrasing that in a way that the monk probably wouldn't be overly excited about, but point here being that I think the courage that comes from being vulnerable and the courage that comes from admitting that you haven't have it all figured out then empowers other people as well, because it gives them the license to come up with new ideas and so on.
So what tips would you have then for someone who is like on a team environment and maybe they're scared of looking like they don't know something, but they don't want to openly communicate this? What would you tell somebody who's in that mindset?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I grew up in a country where, we get trained in the idea of avoid uncertainty, avoid ambiguity, plan everything. So I'm from Germany. And, we kind of like, you don't, like, especially as a guy, right? You don't grow up saying, oh, you admit kind of these kind of things, right? And so I think one of the things I found extremely kind of helpful for myself also is to think about, like, what is that kind of degree that I feel comfortable? Like, what are the areas where I'm okay to feel vulnerable versus what are the areas where I don't feel okay to be vulnerable? And I think in my case, for example, I feel much more comfortable being vulnerable in areas where I'm really good at, because essentially what I can then say is like, hey, look, here's my vulnerability. Here's how I've overcome some of this, and here's quote unquote success around this and everything else. Versus, in areas where I don't have that, I'm like, yeah, let me talk about it once I kind of like get to the other side of it. And so I think one of the things is, I think a lot of times, to give an example, one of the organizations I admire is Reconstructed Living Labs in South Africa. It's essentially former drug addicts and others who kind of extremely vulnerable people potentially, but who said, okay, we will develop a low-income education solution here that we can take into other communities, and that enables people like us to become teachers and to do like, hey, these are 5 steps of how to use social media. These are 5 steps of how to build a business. And so essentially a very simple way to quote unquote become empowered and then to become a teacher and to become who you can become. And what I found fascinating about it is that just this idea that in a way you see the potentiality of what could be, and you bring that into different contexts. I've seen that with myself as well. Like, as soon as I realize there is potentiality, I reframe situations away from, oh, I'm just XYZ, or, oh, like, I'm not supposed to XYZ, to, oh, wow, like, this potentiality there is beautiful. And, I will never forget, like, the first time I got there, I went into so Bridgetown, which is the part of the Cape Flats in South Africa, in Cape Town, which is kind of like very crime-ridden and high unemployment and so on. And, they're like, it's mostly kind of, Black community that lives there. And, there's obviously a big racial divide in South Africa. And I will never forget when I came there the first time, and I asked one of the kids, so, hey, one day will you be at the University of Cape Town, like on the mountain, when like they look up, and they would be like, no, that's for the white people. Like, that's not for us. And so that broke my heart, right? Because you're like, wow, like there is this kind of idea that like, this is for some part of the population, this is for the other part of the population. And what I found fascinating about the Reconstructed Living Labs model is to say, no, we start imagining how it could be that some of us could be there. And then we kind of like work with the government to remove some of the structural constraints, and we work with other partners to do something around this. But actually then at the end of the day, we, in a way, what was fascinating to see is how the University of Cape Town now comes to them, because they found an amazing kind of model of doing this. But long story short, what I really appreciated about them was the community drivenness, where it really came from kind of like not the government coming in and pushing things on people, but people being the ones who shaped it and working together with the government. And I think, to me, that idea of in a way seeing what is already here and then kind of working based on this with others versus like, I feel like, it's a very long answer to a short question, but, one of the things that I've always kind of dreaded was, especially when you come as someone, from a Western context. I started working in Kenya 10 years ago. And when I went the first time to Kenya and South Africa, I asked one of the guys who work with this organization, what should I never ask you as the kind of white kid coming into your context here? And they said, well, never ask us what we need, because if you ask as a first question, because if you ask us what we need, you put us into in the position of a victim, of a beneficiary, of someone who needs something from you. Versus if you come in and say, what's already here, what can we do together? And then we can still talk about resources later. But essentially, this is much more symmetric. And to me, this always stuck because it's about this idea of how do I essentially enable like this idea that we have agency, we have some kind of agency, and we have to do something with this agency, but then obviously also being part of removing structural constraints. And I think that really starts in childhood, in terms of how we can do something about this. But that was a very long answer to a very short question.
No, I think it's very good. And also you kind of lay the blueprint and foundation for what to do if you are trying to cultivate psychological safety on your team. Like, I think there's a lesson there to be learned and applied as well. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciated it. So let's talk about networking events, right? We touched on a little bit earlier, but just to make it extremely clear for the audience out there, suppose we're at a networking event. What can we do, or how can we change the way that we speak to ensure that we're opening ourselves up for this serendipity?
I'm a huge fan, especially if one is more introverted, to start like to at the beginning talk with the host, talk with the key people who are the kind of key multipliers. Because if we can seed an idea with them, if we can seed something with them, they will talk with so many other people, so they can become our ambassadors. So let's say we have a new business idea or something we want to seed in the room. That's a lot about saying, okay, let's talk about the key people who could then talk with other people. Then we don't have to do it ourselves. But obviously we always have to in either way. But I'm also a big fan of focusing on really developing meaningful relationships, because I think a lot of times people focus on this, let's meet as many people as possible, let's kind of maximize X, Y, Z. But that's not how you actually develop really interesting things, right? Really interesting things take time, really interesting relationships take time. And so I'm a big fan of, I've seen that with myself and others, that when you go into a room, you energetically see, right, which are the people who kind of have green energy, quote unquote, versus red energy. And I think when I was younger, I forced a lot of times speaking with those with the red energy, because I was like, no, but I still want to convince everyone. I want to be everywhere. And then at some point I realized, you know what, like the real serendipity happens talking with the green energy person, or someone who really kind of, where I feel there's some kind of resonance, because that people will probably know someone else who might have X, Y, Z anyways. And so it's the point being that I think at networking events, kind of forcing oneself to speak with people that is important, but also I think speaking with those that we feel really kind of a resonance with versus trying to force stuff that doesn't make sense. And I think we talked about, right, the kind of questions, asking questions differently, getting away from just asking what do you do to asking things like, what did you find most inspiring about the presentation before? Or, just something that opens up that opportunity space where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence, can really help.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. For those listening, the energies, I believe that's from the DISC profile, DISC. So definitely check that out. I'll leave a link to that. Last formal question before we jump into a super quick lightning round. And that is, it's 100 years in the future. what do you want to be remembered for?
It's a great question. I'm a big fan of Mark Twain, who has this whole thing around you regret the things you haven't done, but also this kind of idea of that in a way when you look back, you should always come from that perspective. So I love the question of really kind of thinking about why are we here in the first place, right? And I think to me, I think the next 10, 20 years of my life will be around this kind of content around the serendipity mindset has become my life philosophy and a daily practice. And I've gotten so much joy from it, so much enthusiasm. I've seen it work in most contexts around the world. And so I think if I can, in a way, get that into curricula, if I can get that to as many people as possible, especially those who might not necessarily yet be in that kind of mindset, who might, kind of believe that luck is something that you can't really influence and things like that. I've seen how quickly when you do small nudges and small kind of behavioral changes, how quickly people then get into that rhythm. And especially those who are like, oh my God, this is not me, actually then get almost addicted to it. They're like, oh my God, like my life has so much more joy to it. So I think if it can be around saying like, this is, someone who helped us turn anxiety towards the unexpected into kind of making the unexpected an ally and making uncertainty an ally rather than a threat, I think then that would have felt meaningful to me. And especially I think in those contexts where we don't have the kind of, a lot of my work is in low income contexts. And I think that is where I feel I want to focus a lot of my energy also on how we can influence government policy and other things around how do we think about societal opportunity spaces that allow people to have a higher serendipity base level, because I feel that's where then a lot of the kind of real development will come from, where people can create their own luck once we remove the barriers to them actually creating it, which is what a lot of, unfortunately, structural inequality does.
Thank you very much for that. It was wonderful talking to you. We'll go into a real quick random round. I know we are short on time, but everybody go get this book. Speaking of the book, where can people find it?
It's on www.theserendipitymindset.com. It's everywhere, Amazon, bookstores, The Serendipity Mindset, The Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. And I'm on Twitter at Chris Serendipity.
Awesome. So quick lightning round question here. What are you currently reading?
Well, I've been rereading Viktor Frankl, literally the third time, because I feel there's always, you reread it all the time. I've also reread the book Attached, which is a wonderful book around attachment styles. And, I just got into a new relationship, so trying to understand how to make sure that it is a wonderful one.
What song do you currently have on repeat?
Good question. I'm really bad with songs and everything else. I love U2 and the kind of Beautiful Day for its kind of both the emotion in it and the kind of, positiveness that comes from it, but also the kind of tragedy that is in it.
I love it. So last question here, we're going to go to a random question generator. All right. Who are some of your heroes?
That's great. That's a cool thing, by the way. This generator. Obviously, I love randomness, so that's wonderful to see. So I definitely, I always loved the idea that Margaret Mead had around that small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. So I always loved that kind of idea. But my biggest hero definitely is Socrates. I would love to hang out with him back, in the Greek days, and he was obviously framing a lot of questions that we still ask, right? Why do we do things? How do we do things? And so I feel Socrates is definitely one of my biggest heroes.
What was your best birthday?
That's a good question. I'm grateful for every birthday I have, being aware of how quickly you might not have a birthday anymore. But I think my 30th was great because it was that kind of, being with good friends. I was in London at the time, which was beautiful. There's a lot of nostalgia related to it.
Dr. Busch, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here today. I really appreciate you coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for the great energy. I love the kind of grounded, positive energy. It's fantastic. Thank you.